Welcome to Lecture 10 on Property and Power. Unit 5 of your textbook analyzes how institutions determine how much surplus there is and how it's divided between people. So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about institutions, and the opening example in the textbook is pirate institutions. The rules of the Royal Rover included Article 1, which stated that every man has a vote in the affairs of the moment, has an equal title to fresh provisions. Article 4, that lights and candles be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any of the crew at that hour still remain inclined for drinking, they are to do so on the open deck. And Article 10, the captain and the quartermaster to receive 2 shares of a prize, which is the booty of a captured ship, the master, boatswain, and gunner, 1 share and a half, and other officers, 1 and a quarter. Everyone else is to receive 1 share, and that's called their dividend. Right, so these rules of the Royal Rover, these institutions, determine how the spoils of piracy were shared among the pirates. Specifically, they were shared in a way that if you were the captain of the ship, your share was twice as much as just a regular pirate. So there was some inequality, although much less inequality than we'll see in Navy ships. We think of institutions in economics as rules of the game. You can think of them as rules of how you play Monopoly, or this is the original Monopoly game, which was called the landlord's game. Institutions are written and unwritten rules that govern how people interact in joint projects and how their products are distributed. They include constraints on behavior, like the no drinking after 8 o'clock. They include incentives, like best pistols for spotting a ship. Right? The institutions in the ultimatum game determine both how the game is played and what the size of the pie is. Right? If I play the ultimatum game with you, or if we play the ultimatum game, the person organizing the game tells us who's going to be a responder, who's going to be the proposer, right? How large the surplus, the rent is that we're able to split up, and then I decide how much to propose, you decide whether or not to accept the offer, and those are the institutions. Institutions determine how rents are distributed in a capitalist economy. Right? So even when economic interactions are voluntary, property owners often have power. For example, when they're able to set the terms of an exchange, we're going to talk about this in a context of making take it or leave it offers. That's the same sort of offer the proposer makes in an ultimatum game, where they're saying to the responder, hey, I'll give you 3 of these $10, take it or leave it, right? If the responder disagrees and rejects the offer, then they both get 0. That's what makes it a take it or leave it offer. Property owners also have power when they bargain with multiple workers. If there's a lot of responders in an ultimatum game, we've already seen evidence that proposers tend to make smaller offers and that those offers tend to be accepted. Right? Responders in that case worry that if they don't take maybe $1 or $2 out of 10, the next person will. And property owners have power when they can impose or threaten to impose costs on others, i.e. if they can terminate the contract and, say, fire a worker. In capitalism, property confers power to employers, right, to monopolists, and to lenders, and we'll see that in the units to come. Right? Here, of course, we see a powerful sort of capitalist economy protesting a rise in minimum wage. That's been sort of the common plate among the capitalist class over the last many decades, right? Back from when the minimum wage is $1 to fights now to increase it to $15 an hour. So we want to be able to evaluate institutions and outcomes. The outcome of an economic interaction we're going to call an allocation. It describes each person's contribution to the project, the product of the project, and how the distribution or how that product is distributed. We evaluate institutions and the outcomes they produce on the basis of both efficiency and fairness. And we can compare the efficiency and fairness of, say, pirate institutions and Navy institutions. Now, evaluating efficiency, right? When we talk about efficiency in economics, we don't mean the most sensible way of doing something. That might be the definition in engineering. Or the most profitable way of doing something. That might be a definition in business. In economics, we have a very precise understanding of efficiency, and allocation is Pareto efficient if there's no other allocation that makes at least one person better off and no person worse off. If an allocation is not efficient, we call it inefficient. Right? Now, the concept of Pareto efficiency is difficult to wrap your head around. Right? You can think about a problem like, is homelessness efficient from an economic perspective? Well, on a very simple level, you might say, well, it is. You couldn't make, say, the person living in this tent better off by moving him into one of these apartments without taking that apartment away from somebody else. And so in the short run, somehow you might say, well, this is efficient. There's no way to help these people without hurting other people. Right? Advocates for addressing homelessness, right, might make the point that, well, actually, right, at least in the longer run, if you provide housing to these people, right, who are living in tents, they'll actually be able to produce enough in the economy to pay for that sort of housing, right? And so ultimately, you could provide housing them without maybe hurting the people who live in apartments right now. Vilfredo Pareto was the person after whom we name this concept of Pareto efficiency. He sought to make economics and sociology fact-based sciences, more similar to engineering or the physical sciences. The Pareto law holds that a small group of people always own most wealth. In his time, he thought that 80% of the wealth was always owned by 20% of the population, although today, the richest 20% of the United States own 90% of the wealth. Given this inequality, Pareto argued that people often fight over their share of the pie. He wrote in 1906, "The efforts of men are utilized in two different ways. They are directed to the production or transformation of economic goods, or else to the appropriation of goods produced by others." Pareto is most famous today for defining the concept of efficiency in economics. Let's think about what efficiency means in the 2x2 that we thought about before. Here we have Bala's payoff and Anil's payoff as they decide whether or not to use integrated pest control, right, or the Terminator pesticide. We know that their payoffs are better if they both use integrated pest control rather than both using Terminator pesticide. But we also know that Anil, for example, if he switches using the Terminator pesticide when Bala is using the integrated pest control, Anil can be much better off. And so there's an incentive always to defect, and we end up down here where they both use the pesticide. Right? From any of these points, we can see allocations, right, that would be better for both players, right? So anything in the green here would be an allocation that would be better for both Anil and Bala than TI. And similarly here and here and here, we can see the sets of outcomes that would be better, that would be Pareto improvements. Right? Now the question is, for each one of these points, right, are the points themselves, is there room for Pareto improvement? And what we see, right, is that if you're both using integrated pest control, that outcome is efficient because there aren't any possible outcomes up here, right? There aren't any dots up there. Same, this is also efficient, right? If Anil is using the Terminator pesticide and Bala is using integrated pest control, there's no other outcome where both individuals could be better off. Same here, right? There's no outcome where both could be better off. Right? The only inefficient outcome in this game is when they both use the Terminator pesticide, because when they both use Terminator pesticide, they could both be better off if they both switch to using integrated pest control. Right? That makes TT inefficient. Right? Now with this definition, right, it helps us understand the idea of a social dilemma in new light. In Unit 4, we said that a social dilemma is a situation in which individual self-interest results in an outcome which is inferior to an outcome that could have occurred if people had acted together. It's kind of a mouthful. Now that we've defined efficiency, clearly we can simply say a social dilemma is a Nash equilibrium that is Pareto inefficient. Besides efficiency, we're also often interested in fairness. And so efficiency provides an incomplete criterion for comparing economic outcomes. Fairness can help us choose between different efficient outcomes. We have substantive judgments of fairness that consider an allocation of income or wealth or happiness or the freedom to act without socially imposed limits. Substantive judgments of fairness look at outcomes and think about whether or not those outcomes are fair. We also have procedural judgments of fairness, which consider whether or not whatever the outcomes are the result of, say, voluntary exchange of private property acquired through legitimate means, or the equal opportunity for economic advantage, or deservingness based on individuals' effort or ethics. So sometimes when we think about fairness, we think about whether or not the result is something that we think is fair, and sometimes we think about whether or not the result was produced by a process that we see as fair. Evaluating fairness is much more difficult than evaluating efficiency. The American philosopher John Rawls offered one way of doing it. He said we had to recognize that fairness applies to all people. And then he suggested that we imagine a veil of ignorance in which you do not know your gender, your ethnicity, your health, your ability, your wealth, your parents, and so on. Then he asks you to choose the institutions you would prefer that would determine inheritance laws, gender roles, and so on. And his argument is that if you were able to choose the institutions you would prefer without knowing what sort of person you were going to be, you would choose institutions that are fair. And he concludes that people would choose institutions that would maximize the payoffs for the worst off people in society, for the poorest among us, because behind a veil of ignorance, we might be the worst off in society. We could think about maybe how we allocate starbursts. If we were in person, if I had 10 starbursts, right, and 2 students in the front of the class to split them up, you might think about what's the best way to allocate those 10 starbursts? Well, the way you would think about that is, well, which allocation would be efficient? And which allocation is fair? Well, if you think about that on your own, and you can pause the video if you want to have a little bit more time. Any allocation is going to be efficient, right? I can take 10 starbursts and give one person 10 of them and 0 to the other student, and there's no way to make the student with 0 better off without making the student with 10 worse off. So any allocation of these is going to be efficient. But most of you probably think the fairest allocation would be for me to provide each student with 5 starbursts. You might disagree if you found out that one of the students likes starbursts a lot more than the other, or whatever. As a side note, right, you could imagine me allocating 5 starbursts to each student, and then them wanting to trade starbursts with one another. Perhaps one of them really likes cherry, and one of them really likes lemon, right? The nice thing about trade, and the reason economists are such big fans of markets, is a voluntary trade by 2 parties is always creating additional surplus for both people, right? You don't trade unless you're getting something better than what you're giving up, at least in your mind, right? So voluntary trades we see as Pareto improvement. So there is a role for trade, but the important thing to recognize is that the initial allocation is necessarily going to be efficient. We want to use these tools now to think about a model that we're going to build up off of the model we introduced in Unit 3. So in Unit 3, Angela owned the land as a farmer. Now, though, we're going to consider situations where there's also a landlord named Bruno. First, Bruno is going to force Angela to work, and second, Bruno is going to make Angela an offer she is willing to accept. And finally, third, Angela and her fellow farmers are going to organize to increase their share of the harvest. So we're thinking about 2 characters, right? A peasant and some sort of conqueror. When Angela owns the land by herself as an independent farmer, she simply maximizes her utilities subject to her feasible frontier. Right? In that case, she would choose allocation C, right? Where she has 16 hours of free time and 9 bushels of grain, and where her marginal rate of transformation, the slope of her feasible frontier, exactly equals her marginal rate of substitution, the slope of her indifference curve. For simplicity, we're going to assume that Angela's preferences are quasi-linear. That might sound like a mouthful, but what it means is that higher indifference curves are simply vertical transformations of the same indifference curve. Right? These 3 are just vertical transformations of one another. Another way of thinking about it is that her marginal rate of substitution is unaffected by the amount of grain she gets. The slope of this indifference curve at 16 hours is exactly the same as this one and this one. Now, if Bruno owns the land, then he's going to get some of the grain too, as the owner. Then we can think of every point within the feasible frontier as representing an allocation. At point E, for example, Angela's working 12 hours. She's producing 10.5 bushels of grain, right? Angela is going to get 5.5 bushels of this grain, and Bruno is going to get the other 5, sorry, not in half, 5.25 bushels of grain. We can similarly describe allocations F, G, and H. And you should do this on your own. Now, if Bruno can impose allocations by force, imagine that he can come and he can just take away as much grain from Angela the peasant as he wants, right? Well, even then, he's going to be constrained by what's technically feasible, right? The amount of grain he can seize from Angela is going to depend on technology or Angela's production function, right? Of course, the more grain she produces, the more he's going to be able to potentially steal. It's also going to depend on biology or Angela's survival constraint, right? So these points along this dashed line show you the combinations of work and grain where Angela will just barely survive. And if you provide her less grain than a point on there, then she won't be able to survive, right? And he won't be able to keep on exploiting her year after year. So Bruno is going to choose the allocation within the technically feasible set, within this purple set, that maximizes his grain seizures, or the distance between the feasible frontier and her survival. Let's consider allocations imposed by force by Bruno. If Angela gets 16 hours of free time, right, that means she's going to be working 8 hours. She's going to be producing 9 bushels of grain, and she would need 3.5 bushels to survive. That means Bruno can seize a maximum of 5.5 bushels from her, with her still surviving. Now, is that the best Bruno could do? We'll consider another amount of free time. If Angela got just 13 hours of free time, she'd be working 11 hours. She would be producing 10 bushels of grain, and she would need 4 of those to survive. Then Bruno would be able to seize a full 6 bushels. And so he seizes more when she has 13 hours of free time than when she has 16 hours of free time. However, Angela gets even less than 13 hours of free time, works even more than 11 hours a day. Bruno is going to get less grain from her because the distance, the vertical distance, right, in what's the feasible set for Bruno is going to get smaller again. Right? So at 13 hours of free time, the marginal rate of substitution, the slope of Angela's survival constraint, is exactly the same as the marginal rate of transformation, the slope of Angela's feasible frontier. Right? If Bruno had her work yet another hour, the extra grain she would need to survive would be greater than the extra grain that she would be able to grow. And so it doesn't make sense for him to have her work more than 11 hours a day or get less than 13 hours a day of free time. Bruno can force Angela then to provide him with 6 bushels of grain. He can just say, your rent here is 6 bushels of grain. You always have to pay me 6 bushels of grain. Now let's consider, though, allocations that need to be agreed to. Right? If Bruno cannot coerce Angela, then he has to offer economically feasible allocations. His grain payments are constrained by technology, biology, but also Angela's reservation option. Right? Whatever else she could do besides working for Bruno, and Angela's preferences. Right? So here we're assuming in this figure that Angela could, with 24 hours of free time, get 2.5 bushels, right, for doing no work, perhaps by relying on relatives or living in a poorhouse or something. Right? Now, the economically feasible set has gotten smaller because as Bruno asks her to work or demands that she work, right, you're going to have to provide Angela with more grain than what she would need to just purely survive, right, since work is also unpleasant. Bruno cannot offer Angela an allocation that makes her worse off than a reservation option, Z, so any point below her reservation indifference curve is going to be a point that she will turn away from. She'll just reject. Right? It'll be like in the ultimatum game when the proposer makes an offer that's too small for the responder to accept. They say, sorry, right? I'm not going to accept your offer of 0. Now, when these allocations are going to be agreed to, right? We know Bruno previously coerced Angela into working 11-hour days and paying him 6 bushels of grain. Angela is no longer going to agree to that because she'd be better off simply accepting her reservation option Z. We can see the previous outcome, right, where she got just 4 bushels, is no longer right acceptable to her. It's below her reservation indifference curve. She's better off at Z than she is at B. Bruno's then going to choose the allocation within the economically feasible set, so above her reservation indifference curve, that maximizes his grain payments, or the vertical distance between her feasible frontier and her reservation indifference curve. If there are many landless farmers out there, right, Angela will accept his take it or leave it offer or his allocation at D. And the idea is at D, that's again where MRS equals MRT. Right? That's the last bushel where the amount of extra grain that she produces is still going to be greater than the extra grain she would demand for the extra hour of work. So if Bruno gets 16 hours, if Angela gets 16 hours of free time, she'd be working 8 hours. She would produce 9 bushels of grain. She would need 4.5 to actually agree to the proposal. Bruno then would get to take 4.5 for himself. Right? That's his point down here. And the point here is the economically feasible surplus for Bruno is less than what was technically feasible when he was able to coerce her. If Angela works more or less than 8 hours, Bruno's going to get less grain. So at 16 hours of free time, the marginal rate of substitution, the slope of Angela's reservation indifference curve, is exactly equal to marginal rate of transformation, the slope of her feasible frontier. The economically feasible surplus is going to be smaller than what's technically feasible. Now, what you want to think about here is the allocation, right, efficient? Well, every allocation with 16 hours of free time is going to be efficient, we'll see. It's going to maximize the surplus of 4.5 bushels. If Bruno can make a take it or leave it offer, he gets all of that surplus. He gets the full 4.5 bushels of surplus, where the other 4.5, which is the minimum required to get someone to do the work, is given to the worker, Angela. Is the allocation fair? Well, on the one hand, you might say, yeah, it seems fair. Angela and Bruno are splitting the grain 50-50. On the other hand, Angela is working for her share. It's not clear. Do you think that Bruno deserves his? Does he deserve to get just as much as Angela, not because he's farming, but because he owns the land? Is that how you would imagine splitting up the grain if you were behind a veil of ignorance and didn't know, for example, if you were going to be the landlord or the worker? Your homework question for this week uses a similar model to think through how a farmer and a landlord would split up grain in the Norwegian fjords, similar to the situation where my grandmother grew up 100 years ago.